Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. So I'm going to try and speak up loudly so you can hear me in the back. I'm a philosopher of science focusing on conceptual questions in immunological research. And I assume that the combination of science and medicine may appear strange to you. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to try and give you a general idea of what it is that some philosophers are actually doing. So the plan for today is to first give you an opinionated primer on philosophy. And I will follow that up with a discussion, a very brief overview actually, of the field called philosophy of medicine, which is more focused on this, let's say, bedside or the clinical side of things. The bulk of my talk, however, will focus on philosophy of biomedical sciences, so more on the basic side of science. And there I will discuss the role of assumptions and the perspectival nature of our knowledge and illustrate that on two examples, namely cancer and immunology. One approach to philosophy is, a specific approach to philosophy can be illustrated is through the historical figures. So philosophers in the history were mostly oriented toward trying to solve various problems. And so they were trying to explain the world, to make sense of it, and they were using the means that were available to them at the time. Now, so these means included, among others, speculation, but also observation, in some cases experimentation, and conceptualization. So take, for instance, Aristotle, who was a keen observer of nature. And for some reason, he was, among other things, interested in the sexual reproduction of octopuses. But he made many other observations. And on the basis of these observations, he tried to formulate some generalizations and sort of understand what governs the world. Until very recently, there was no meaningful distinction between science and philosophy. And it is only, let's say, in the past 200 years, with the division of labor and specialization, that we now make this distinction. Another way to see philosophy, another approach to do philosophy can be broadly understood in terms of history of philosophy. So what I mean by that is that those involved in this kind of approach study the systems of thought of for instance, historical figures. And again, we can take the example of Aristotle. So what you do here is you read what Aristotle wrote, for instance. You try to interpret that work and maybe make some comparisons with other authors. And and this is actually what you maybe have experienced in high school. This is also predominantly what you do when you try to do philosophy degree at the university level, and also what the arguably majority of philosophers spend their time on in their research. Now, what I want to suggest here is that the former approach, the first one, is still alive and kicking. And that's the one that I want to basically present here. So looking at philosophy, it's arguably the most diverse discipline there is, because philosophers deal and focus on many different topics, many different issues. And they use very different methodologies. So while some philosophers make use of empirical data, empirical research, some others don't. There are also philosophers who make use of mathematical apparatus, who make use of modeling, who gather quantitative and qualitative data. And philosophers also rarely, but still some do, experiments. And yet other philosophers make use of thought experiments. So is there a unified view of philosophy, something that philosophy can be defined by? Well, what I just said is that there is no definition in terms of topics, but also not in terms of methodology. And this is in part the reason for why philosophers that deal with very different topics, very different methodologies, don't often talk to one another and don't even understand one another because of this extreme diversity of the ways and the things that philosophers deal with. So arguably one way to maybe still understand what philosophy may be about is by focusing on this kind of fleshing out the consequences. So what I mean by that is illustrated by this abstract figure. And at the very top, we can have a concept, we can have a claim or a question. And so what you try to do is see what kind of, so to unpack this concept or this question, see what follows from that, and see what follows further down the line, and ultimately provide this explicit structure to understand better what the original claim or concept has been hiding, so to say. Now, sometimes there are problems with philosophy, and basically with any other discipline. So sometimes it is the case that philosophers address an issue without taking into account the best kind of empirical knowledge that we have on that particular issue, or that they do not use the best available methodology in order to inquire into what's going on. The other issue is that sometimes those debates may be getting a bit too abstract, and they may be losing contact with what is actually important. So this is why it's important always to sort of gain competence, so to engage with what is actually known, and not lose sight of what is important, what is practical in some sense. So I guess the combination of philosophy of medicine, after all, may not be so strange, since I'm sure you've all heard about the field called bioethics. Now, this is something I don't want to discuss here at all. I'm just referring to acknowledging its existence and its importance, and maybe referring here to two of my Czech colleagues who have recently published books on euthanasia, for example. So what I'm instead going to give you is a brief overview of some of the questions addressed by philosophers of medicine who do not focus on the ethical questions, but rather on, let's say, medical knowledge. If you are interested in this, then there is this online encyclopedia of philosophy called Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And the entry of philosophy of medicine is a good introduction into some of these questions. Arguably, the most discussed question is about health and disease, and how can we define these notions. So the simplest definition of health is the absence of disease. A more interesting definition is provided by the World Health Organization, which suggests that disease is not a mere absence. That health is not a mere absence of disease, but rather the status of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Now, of course, in order to make these definitions into something more, you have to analyze this further. Another approach to understanding or explaining health is by analyzing certain high-level concepts used in biology. So one example that has been proposed is to understand health as the capacity to maintain homeostasis. Now, again, I don't have the time to go into details, but just to showcase this might not actually work, is because certain phenomena do exhibit homeostasis, but in the pathological sense. So there is something called pathological homeostasis, and therefore health cannot be merely fleshed out in terms of the capacity to maintain homeostasis. Even more discussion concerns the notion of disease. So what is disease? And here philosophers have focused on the question whether disease can be something that is purely of biological nature, or whether social determinants, culture, and values play a role in deciding whether or not something should and does count as a disease. So an example are contested diseases. Until very recently, most of the medical establishment has questioned whether chronic fatigue syndrome, what's in lay terms called that way, so whether that is in fact a real disease or not, or the debate whether aging, because we know that there are a bunch of age-related diseases, so whether aging itself should be considered as a disease or whether there is something that could be perceived as healthy aging. And so these definitions kind of should not be understood only as a sort of wordplay, as a terminological play, but rather in their sort of practical implications, namely that whether or not something counts as a disease also influences whether or not that particular state is something that we want to treat if indeed we can somehow manipulate that state. And furthermore, of course, it may also play a role in, for instance, deciding about health insurance, whether something is a disease may impact these kind of questions. So the another kind of huge topic on which philosophers have spent a considerable amount of time is the evidence-based medicine movement. And namely here, philosophers have been investigating the hierarchy of evidence, which I'm sure you've all seen before, where the gold standard for evaluating the efficacy of medical interventions is randomized controlled trials. At the bottom or the lower end of the spectrum sits mechanistic evidence, which is these mechanistic studies done on, for instance, animal models. And what philosophers have been investigating is under what circumstances or what kind of conditions perhaps situate mechanistic evidence better in this hierarchy, and the question whether mechanistic evidence should, and again, under what circumstances be or is even required to better evaluate the efficacy of medical interventions. They've also analyzed the possibility of various biases in the practice and trying to suggest solutions to those biases. They have discussed the nature of statistics, as you also surely know that the different interpretations of statistics. So, for instance, whether frequentist statistics or Bayesian approach is better, and again, under what sort of circumstances and when. More recently, the methodological question in this context, in the EBM context, is in the context of precision medicine or personalized medicine. And here, so I mentioned the gold standard of evaluating the efficacy of medical interventions by mentioning the randomized controlled trials, which require a large sample sizes to be informative, right? And so then if you have personalized medicine and trying to evaluate the efficacy, basically what you have is just the individual in the ideal case, which means that the sample size is equal to 1. And therefore, this is somewhat in conflict with the standard approach to evidence-based medicine and this hierarchy of evidence. At least that's the claim. Now, some medical doctors have actually decided to pursue a career in philosophy of medicine rather than maintain their practice. And there are many examples. I'm just going to give you two. So one is Jacob Stegenga from Cambridge, who has a background in physiology and has recently published an introductory textbook on philosophy of medicine. The other is Jeremy Howick from Oxford, who, after serving some time in clinical practice, decided to also invest into, let's say, these philosophical debates. And he has published a very influential book on EBM. Now, philosophy of medicine is a part of a much larger field called philosophy of science. And this is getting us to the topic of basic science and the nature of that. And so what philosophers of science do is they are interested in learning how science works and analyzing, for instance, different kind of explanations, mechanistic explanations, statistical explanations, how these relate to each other, and in what sort of disciplines. Also, the nature of theories, the nature of models and modeling are among the key questions, and so on and so forth. They also analyze scientific concepts and methods, and they deal with this demarcation issue, which is the distinction between science, non-science, and pseudoscience. So in this context, it would be medicine and alternative or pseudomedicine. Now, assumptions and perspectival nature are two things through which I hope to address the ways in which science can deal with complexity, with complex phenomena that oftentimes are the target of studies. So adopting assumptions serve in the goal to reduce complexity. And so they serve to make a phenomenon more tractable to study. And the prime example are mathematical models. So there is actually a joke in the physics community about spherical cows, which I think is self-explanatory. But there is a deeper thought behind this sort of joke. So these kind of simplifications that are necessary in science is actually what provides insight into, or facilitate insight into, the kind of phenomena that we study. So it's not that simplifications are something that we necessarily need to get rid of, but rather something that in the first place allows us to gain any insight. And the same can be said about in vitro models and in vivo models, which both are sort of artificial systems which are being studied in order to, again, gain insight into the phenomena that we are ultimately interested in. And the kind of access they facilitate is also sort of simplified. They are simplified systems. And again, as I said, they are highly artificial in some sense. And they only facilitate insight, but limited insight and partial insight. And it's important to note about these kind of simplifications always, because in fact, these kind of manipulations that are being done on those systems are also what in part at least can explain the discrepancy between the data that is being published in some cases. Again, this is not at all meant as a criticism, but rather as a statement of fact. So the other kind of way to understand the nature of science is through this perspectival nature. And again, it is the goal is to reduce complexity and make a phenomenon more tractable to study. So what is perspectivism? Well, it is about adopting a theoretical perspective or a framework through which a phenomenon can be conceptualized in an empirically grounded fashion. Now, adopting a particular perspective also sort of influences what kind of data we look for. And finally, it provides a partial and imprecise snippet of a complex phenomena. Now, what perspectivism isn't, it isn't a claim that any point of view is equally valid. Now, just to use a metaphorical illustration, and as any metaphor goes, it's valid only up to a certain point. So consider this picture, which sort of illustrates this perspectival nature. But again, to some extent, it should not be taken too seriously. So let's move on to the examples, starting with cancer. And let me just note that, again, the topic of cancer has been gaining prominence in philosophical discussions, and a series of books have been published on the topic. But also philosophers have published in science journals, including some of the very top journals there are. Furthermore, philosophers have also been involved in organizing events where philosophers working on topics in cancer and cancer researchers are both presenting their work. And for instance, this is one series of such workshops which was attended by high-profile people in the community, including people like Hans Clevers, whom you might have heard about, at least if you work on cancer. So the driving question is going to be, what is cancer? And again, it's going to be approached through this perspectival nature. And remember that a perspective is something that directs attention to the investigation of specific properties or aspects of said phenomena. So here, cancer. Now, the word cancer itself is, in some sense, ambiguous. So it is reserved, in a more narrow sense, in the oncology clinics to refer to abnormal growths that are invasive. In contrast, the word is used more loosely in cancer research, where it's used to refer to basically any abnormal growth. And so here we can look at some comparative perspectives stemming from comparative biology or comparative oncology. So the question is, what counts as cancer? And you can consider fasciations as an example. So what we see here is a picture of abnormal growth found in plants called fasciations. And these have been termed either cancer or cancer-like phenomena by researchers. We can also ask the question, where do we find cancer or cancer-like phenomena across the tree of life? And so research has been done in this regard to investigate these cancer-like phenomena across the tree of life. So the idea is to identify commonalities and differences in terms of mechanisms, tissue architecture, and development, and ultimately in hope to search and find anti-cancer mechanisms that can be used then in therapies. And so in this comparative perspective, it is important to consider those so-called negative models. So these would be organisms such as naked mole rat that exhibit relative absence of invasive growth. And what you try to find out is, why is it that they exhibit this relative absence of invasive growth rather than the invasive growth and metastasis that we observe in other organisms such as ourselves. This relates to evolutionary perspectives on cancer, which have been actually extremely fruitful in illuminating some of the issues in cancer research. So, for example, the classical Darwinian natural selection has been used to explain phenomena such as the incidence of germline mutations that increase cancer risk. They've been also involved in explaining the evolved anti-cancer mechanisms or the tumor development itself, stemming from this adoption of clonal somatic evolution, which basically talks about the competition, but also collaboration between cell lineages and the differences in variation, heritability, and fitness, which then gives rise to differences in terms of cell proliferation. And so this sort of classical Darwinian approach can also account for all the famous hallmarks of cancer. And so a discussion or the use of evolutionary perspective is also more profound in the way that it's being discussed, whether we can also apply multi-level selection fruitfully in the context of cancer. So what multi-level selection basically means is that we find conflict between selection at the levels of individual cells or group of cells and at the level of the organism as a whole. So what this then comes down to is the question whether we can apply this social evolutionary theory framework with all its theoretical apparatus in a fruitful way to, again, illuminate certain aspects of cancer. And so what follows from this is a bunch of questions such as, can we treat cancer cells as cheats in this highly technical term of the word, rather than some metaphorical way of speaking? And the question whether there is enough empirical evidence supporting the view that cancer cells exhibit or somehow embody reversion to a unicellular state of unicellular mode of life, also called atavistic theory, because if there is enough evidence supporting this, then indeed the multi-level selection would be fruitful in accounting for the origins of cancer. So when you think about cancer, the most common view is that it's a genetic disease. So in the rest of the talk, actually, when I'm saying cancer or anything like that, what I mean is cancers of epithelial origin. So we're talking about carcinomas rather than solid cancers and of epithelial origins. So cancer arises as a result of accumulation of so-called driver mutations in epithelial founder cell. Now, these driver mutations occur in oncogenes or tumor suppressor genes, and can also be, of course, rather than mutations, can be epigenetic. Whatever it is, this sort of search for drivers of cancer genesis are embodied in this famous Cancer Genome Project. And so on this genetic disease view, cancer is viewed as a clonal cell-based disease. And again, this sort of genetic view is what underpins all the famous hallmarks of cancer. Now, alternative views also exist, one of which is that we should rather think of cancer in terms of a disease of a tissue. So what this amounts to is that carcinogenesis may take place at the tissue level rather than at the individual cell founder level. And again, what this then implies, or how is this fleshed out, is that there is disturbance in the stromal epithelial communication or interaction. Now, there are two ways to understand this better. So one is the importance of tissue context. So observations suggest that even though we might find cells which do carry cancer-associated mutations, nevertheless, we do not observe cancer. And why is that? Well, because those cells are prohibited by the tissue context. So they are basically restrained and do not give rise to cancer. Sometimes there is some discussion about occult cancer or occult tumors, and so on. So the other sort of motivation for such a view is the fact that, or rather the fact stemming from certain experiments, is that carcinogens might be targeting stroma rather than the epithelial part of tissue. So you can actually separate the epithelial and the stromal part and expose them individually to carcinogens, and then when you combine them, see whether there is an overt cancer. And so what some research suggests is that cancer arises when you actually expose the stromal part rather than the epithelial part. And also there is the phenomena called normalization, where when you have an overt cancer, like carcinoma, and you insert it into a perfectly normal tissue context, perfectly normal stromal, then that sort of carcinoma can get normalized. Now, there are two things I want to note here. One is that, of course, this is highly sensitive to the particular experimental context that we are talking about. This is not a claim that, across the whole spectrum of life, this is how cancer works. So that's the one claim. And the other claim is that this is not a question or an either-or question. So it is not as if we were supposed to think about cancer either in terms of cancer being a genetic disease or cancer being a disease of a tissue. Rather, the point is that these are two perspectives that both stem from certain experimental evidence and both suggest studying kind of different sort of experimental evidence. And then, so what's best is that we can, by entertaining both, we can actually get a much better grip and overall understanding of cancer. So it has been suggested that, historically speaking, these two kind of very general views on cancer have been result of the kind of experimental models that played a prominent role in different research programs. So the view that cancer is a genetic disease has been developed mostly by studying 2D cell cultures in vitro studies and inducing mutations in such systems. And the other view is more informed or stemming from the studies on organogenesis and morphogenesis. So even here we see that basically different kind of research programs can motivate different views on what is ultimately the same kind of phenomena. So there are also metabolic perspectives, and so what I do not mean here is the well-known fact that cancer cells exhibit altered metabolism, but rather a more profound claim, according to which cancer can be construed as a metabolic disease. So what this means is as a suggestion, again based on many empirical research, is that at least in some cases, it is the impairment in mitochondrial functions that gives rise to all the known hallmarks. And so basically the impaired mitochondrial dysfunction could be a cause of cancer. And so it is not that genomic instability, which oftentimes is said to underpin all the processes leading up to cancer eventually, is the cause, but rather the genomic instability can be the effect, and vice versa. So it is the suggestion that impairment of mitochondrial function can be the driver of cancer rather than the effect of carcinogenesis. Similarly, we can also entertain infectious disease perspectives. And again, here, the idea is not the well-known fact that there are several known viruses that cause cancer, but rather sort of adopting this theoretical framework and this kind of conceptual framework behind infectious diseases, and looking and shifting focus from treating cancer, shifting focus from tumorigenesis, which is to say how cancer growth, to a metastasis, which is to say how cancer spreads. And so people have adopted many notions and concepts and have done experiments from concepts from ecology to also illustrate this idea because, for example, different environmental context is important in metastasis since the original tumor site has different sort of microenvironment than ultimately the metastatic secondary site. And so this is well-known seed and soil hypothesis, for example, which also plays a role and is being actively investigated in this context. So to really bring home the message of this perspectival nature, consider the recent breakthrough or achievement of medicine for which a Nobel Prize was awarded in 2018, namely the approval of checkpoint inhibitors in cancer immunotherapy. I don't know if you have seen this documentary which portrays one of the two recipients, Jim Allison, but I can highly recommend it. And so here is the perspective, the different kind of perspectives that we can entertain is that originally it was thought that we should directly target the cancer cells and destroy them. But what some people have thought about is that instead we can focus on the microenvironment and target the microenvironment and thereby indirectly target the cancer cells. And again, this required a shift in research perspective. But more profoundly, what it also required is a sort of profound change in the criteria by which cancer therapies are being evaluated in clinical trials. So it is well known, in clinical trials, what people have observed is that, for instance, chemotherapy oftentimes is followed, and what you observe is shrinking in the tumor mass. That's basically what you need to observe in order to continue the clinical trial, or that was the case. Now, immunotherapy and the checkpoint inhibitors were kind of in conflict with that. Namely, they were leading to an increase in tumor mass, at least originally. And so it was important to explain on a theoretical level the mechanism by which cancer immunotherapies were supposed to work in order to gain approval to continue the clinical trial. Because if the patient is getting worse in this kind of criteria by, namely the size of the tumor, then FDA almost basically stopped it. Because it seemed that the patient might be actually getting worse. Now, to summarize this part, and the role of philosophers, so sometimes it is important to be clear on definitions, because the same term can be used to refer to different phenomena. And what we need to do is to make distinctions in order to avoid talking cross purposes. Now, philosophers are also very much interested in the kind of implicit assumptions in research. And they also are interested in sort of presenting and evaluating existing frameworks or perspectives, and even seeing whether maybe adopting a particular perspective is sort of a mistake, because just because we adopt a perspective doesn't mean that that perspective is necessarily a good one, or that it fits nicely, or that there is anything useful that follows from that, but rather maybe a case of a misapplication where a perspective misleads the research, or further sort of confuses it or obscures in terms of using the same term to refer to different phenomena and not recognizing it as such. Philosophers are also interested in the ways in which different frameworks or different perspectives may be integrated. And they also try to facilitate interdisciplinary debates by bringing different researchers from different kind of fields, let's say from the clinic, oncology clinic, to cancer biology, evolutionary biology, and philosophy of cancer. So now I will be more brief in the second example taken from immunology. And again, I just list some of the books that have been published on several issues in immunological research. And again, we can find many papers on this topic, some of which have been published in the top journals, in top science journals, not just philosophy journals. The predominant idea in immunology, still to this day, is that the immune system is a defense system. This means that the immune system is said to defend the host from pathogens, for instance. And this goes back to Pasteur and Koch, if not even further, and to the origins of the germ theory of diseases. Relatedly to this, it's been sort of suggested that the immune system recognizes non-self, so foreign particles, for instance, and attacks those or destroys those particles. And that at the same time, the immune system must tolerate self, so not respond to self, not recognize even self. And if it does, then what we get as a result is autoimmune diseases. So this sort of self-non-self theory had to be reconceptualized because of recent findings. Again, this is something I assume you might know, you will definitely know, is that there are many important phenomena where the immune system tolerates non-self. Let me give you two examples, just in case. So one is microbiome. If the immune system needs to actively tolerate the microbiome, and if it doesn't, then what we get is inflammation of the gut, for example. The other example is pregnancy. Maternal tolerance is a well-known phenomena, where the maternal immune system needs to actively tolerate the basically half foreign entity, the fetus, the developing fetus. And if it doesn't, then it's going to get immunologically rejected, which results in in many miscarriages. Similarly, self-recognition is not only in the generation of regulatory T cells, but has a more prominent role to play in, for example, maintaining memory T cell homeostasis. So those kind of memory T cells have to recognize self-peptide, self-MHE molecules in order to basically survive. And even though this goes back to at least 20 years of discussion, nowadays it is a well-known, acknowledged fact in the major immunology textbooks. So the idea that the immune system is a defense system is one thing, but also recent findings suggest that we need to move beyond this perspective. So it has been suggested that the immune system is not necessarily a killer, even though, of course, it kind of is. But more profoundly, it is something that shapes homeostasis or that is involved in the maintenance of cohesiveness of the organism. Now, whatever it is, ultimately what needs to be recognized and what is being currently recognized is that the immune system is involved in processes other than defense. So even though defense is, of course, one of the functions of the immune system is also involved in processes such as clearance of debris, in maintenance of homeostasis, in tissue repair, and interestingly also in ontogeny in development. Now, I'm going to engage in a little bit of shameless self-promotion here by referring to just one recent paper that I've published with a colleague of mine, where we are discussing some of these issues and what comes further, namely this sort of organismal or system perspective on the immune system. So one thing to say is that the function of defense is realized by non-immune components. So actually, defense goes beyond the confines of the immune system, which is to say that non-immune cells are crucial in this realization of defense because even non-immune cells exhibit some of the same features of, as do the immune cells, of course, even though, of course, there is specialization. But that by itself, that sort of fact, should not omit the realization that non-immune cells are crucial in defense. The second sort of thing to note here is that defense does not merely lie in elimination of, for instance, the pathogen. So in order to maintain health, ultimately in one way or another, we do need to eliminate the pathogen, and this has been referred by the term called disease resistance. So what this means is that the immune system lowers the pathogen load or the pathogen burden. However, equally important strategy of the body is to mitigate the negative presence, the presence of the pathogen, and also the response to it, which is well known because of the issue of immunopathology, which can be severe and even deadly. And so this sort of mitigation phenomena has been called in the literature disease tolerance. And so disease resistance is about lowering the pathogen load and thereby maintaining health, whereas disease tolerance has no impact on the pathogen load, but still maintains health by mitigating these negative impacts of the response. So there is this picture that I have here. Yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, yeah, here we are. So we can. I hope you can see these. There are two lines. So one is more thick, and the other not so much. So this can be interpreted as two individuals or two different strains of mice, for example. And please note that, of course, this is a caricature, but behind this are actual data from research, some of which are referred in the paper. And so what we see there is that two different strains of mice, for example, can exhibit different health status when it comes to when in fact they have the same pathogen load. And so they can be immunocompetent, they can be equally capable of getting rid of the pathogen causing disease. However, they still differ in terms of mortality and morbidity because of these differences in disease tolerance. And this has importance in considering the development of new novel therapies, because by not only focusing on the kind of approach by, for instance, boosting the eliminative capabilities of the immune system, so by lowering the pathogen burden, we can also sort of manipulate the disease tolerance mechanisms. And again, this has been proven across the spectrum of different conditions. And in fact, this concept of disease tolerance is an old one. So it goes back to, it has been adopted from plant ecology studies, at least from studies 100 years ago. And I mean, it's not that rather the concept originated, but has been actually present throughout those past 100 years. And only recently, it caught attention of some ecologists and immunologists who joined forces to see whether this is valid also for invertebrates and vertebrate immune systems. And in fact, it is. So let me conclude. So what I tried to do in this talk is to give you sort of a particle view on philosophy. So this sort of view is oriented toward, let's say, practical problems rather than less practical issues. And I tried to sort of give you the idea of what's behind such an approach, generally speaking. So it is this idea of fleshing out the consequences. So again, we have some sort of general notion or concept, and basically we unpack and analyze that concept further and see what follows. Of course, sorry, getting ahead of myself. Of course, what I didn't do is I didn't present this in significant detail, which the time doesn't allow me to do. But hopefully, at least I try to give you the idea of how this is supposed to work. Now, again, my mistake. So as a philosopher, to make a contribution, of course, it requires to gain certain level of competence in a given problematic that you want to address. So now, finally, I can show you some pictures again. So what it requires is to basically take up a textbook and start reading and move on. Attend lectures, do formal education, etc., etc. What I did also is that I've spent several months in an immunology lab in order to not only understand the theoretical side of things, but also to learn about how experiments are being done, about the experimental methods and protocols, and basically how knowledge is produced, and not just to passively sort of accept everything as it is being presented. So basically to better understand the scientific endeavor in this sort of experimental way. So what is the at the bottom line is that basically you try to identify a scientific problem, use philosophical tools to propose a scientific solution. And so what these tools are, well, there are many. Let me just list a few. So usually it's called things like conceptual analysis, examination of arguments, drawing distinctions, reading around different subjects or different topics, different disciplines even, historical awareness of some debates or some concepts, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, this is not to suggest that this is necessarily specific to philosophy. Of course, it isn't, and many scientists on daily basis make use of these tools. But however, this is something that philosophers are trained in, and what they focus on and what they do in their career. So they're basically specialists in some sense in using these tools. Now, to make a contribution to produce new knowledge often requires, in this kind of interdisciplinary fashion, often requires collaboration, which ultimately should result in joint publications. And so here I just list one such example where a philosopher, a dear colleague of mine, has joined forces, so to speak, with several immunologists and proposed a new theory of immunogenicity and published in one of the major journals. But actually, there could be hundreds of, there are hundreds of other examples that one can give. So this is not just one successful story, but rather an illustration of a trend. Okay, so what I did then further is I very briefly talked about this field called philosophy of medicine, which, among other things, mostly focuses on topics such as what is health, what is disease, this whole issue of evidence-based medicine. And then I talked about the importance of assumptions and the perspectival nature of knowledge in science. So what this comes down to is that we must be taking into account the assumptions that make complexity tractable, investigating different perspectives, seeking connections and disconnections, proposing changes to existing frameworks or developing new ones. And I tried to sort of motivate this by using two examples, namely cancer and immunology. And with that, I would like to thank you for coming and for your attention. So thanks.